happy to introduce Professor of Art History, Damon Willick, and
Hello, everyone. I'm Damon Willick. I'm going to introduce my very good friend Antoine Wilson, who I've known now for close to 20 years, I want to say. We met as fresh out of undergrad. Hello. Okay, so we met. We both went to UCLA. He was dating a friend of my wife's, and he and I have gone surfing probably.
I think we started surfing in '95, so almost 20 years. And we used to sit in the water when we were kids, felt like we were adults, and we would sit there and dream about, someday, dude, someday I'm going to be a novelist. Yeah. Someday I'm going to be a professor. Yeah. And then when we weren't in the water, we actually took steps toward doing those things, and now here we are.
That's right. So Antoine went to the writers program at Iowa. He's written two novels.
Two published novels.
Two published novels.
There are others.
And it's really exciting for me. So when I was asked to do a pub night, they asked what format would I like, and Antoine's last book was entitled Panorama City. And I was born in Panorama City, and I couldn't think of a better person to have a conversation about the Valley than someone that's written about the Valley and someone who I truly respect.
Damon was born in the Valley and grew up in the Valley, and I'm from Montreal originally, but from junior high on, I grew up in Santa Monica. So that's, for those of you who know history of the West Side, with sort of like Vals go home, stay off our beaches, et cetera, et cetera. Well, now Damon sort of thinks I'm like a wannabe Val, like I'm trying to jump on some Valley bandwagon. I think I look to the Valley as a blank place to inscribe my fantasies and ideas on, probably. In any case, Damon Willick is an associate professor of art history here at Loyola Marymount University, and he chose this university because he wanted to have the highest altitude school in Greater Los Angeles. This is an amazing view. We should probably talk about this exhibition.
All right. So the exhibition that I've curated, in which there is a book published by Angel City Press, the exhibition is currently at Cal State Northridge, and it closes October 11th. There's an artist panel September 27th, in which I'll be talking with three great artists, Jeffrey Valance, who we'll talk about, Carla Claren, and the performance artist Barry Markowitz. And that's September 27th at 1 p.m.
That's going to be amazing. How many artists are in the exhibit altogether?
There are about 42 artists. All the artists have some connection to the Valley. Some were born there, others went to school there, and a few taught there.
So the origin myth of this show is that Damon was walking around checking out Pacific Standard Time, the Getty exhibit focusing on art in Los Angeles, and was walking through and just suddenly had this epiphany: where are the Vals? How come there's all these artists that came out of the Valley and were working in the Valley? How come they're not represented here in this exhibition? So can you talk a bit about how this thing came to be from that moment, that spark?
Sure. So I'm just curious: are there any Vals amongst us? It's okay to raise your hand. It's all right. This is a safe space. All right, there are only 3 of us in the room. That's amazing. And that's sort of how I felt walking through Pacific Standard Time shows, which was a wonderful series of exhibitions that the Getty funded. The Getty had their own survey of Los Angeles art. And being from the Valley, I've always been sensitive to how histories of Los Angeles exclude a large area of the city itself. And people mistake the Valley as being outside of Los Angeles or as somehow being close to Los Angeles. But in fact, most of the San Fernando Valley is within the city limits. 1.8 million people live in the valley. So as a historian, not only as a Val, but as a historian, when I was walking through these exhibitions, I couldn't help but think, what would the story be if we included the valley? Right? What sort of art history would emerge if it wasn't all Ed Ruscha from the Ferris Gallery, and if it wasn't all other heroic Chris Burden from Venice, or these great artists who are undoubtedly art historically significant. But I couldn't help but think, why not Jeffrey Valens? Why not Robert Williams? Why not other artists that were connected with the Valley or from the Valley? And so it was from that one question about 3 years ago that I started this research. And from that one question, and I should say, too, that I wrote my dissertation on Los Angeles art history, so I came to that question from an area of expertise. And maybe being from the Valley, I will always use quotes when I raise attention to my expertise, because I see history as malleable. And so I came to this question from some knowledge of what Los Angeles is, and I hope to expand that discourse.
It's malleable as written by the victors, and this book is a victory. You're taking a victory lap. So let's go back to when you were working on your dissertation, and you said you were doing a lot of LA art history research. I'm curious as to, did you at that time, in your research, sort of stumble across certain things that were going on in the Valley that you didn't know about? Did you grow up in an artistic environment in the Valley? I mean, they existed, presumably.
Right.
I feel like we can speak freely because there are only 3 Vals in the room. I couldn't pull this off at Northridge.
There you go. John DeVol is I hate.
She was reading the screen. That's all.
So I did not grow up in an artistic family. I grew up with Norman Rockwell prints on the wall, and my mom, when I now say this to my mom, she goes, but we also had Susan Rios prints, and Susan Rios is just sort of kitschy prints, and so I did not grow up with a broad understanding of art history. While doing my dissertation in the late 90s, I started my dissertation. I remember professors asking the same questions that I'm being asked now. Why Los Angeles? So this was before Pacific Standard Time. This was before the Getty Center had opened on the Hill in Brentwood. And so there were some questions how I could write a dissertation on Los Angeles. While doing research on Ed Kienholz, a wonderful, wonderful artist, I would come across the Valley. His first studio was in the Valley, and that sort of perked my interest. His first art sale was to a dentist in Van Nuys, and I really liked that. When I was reading some old copies of the Los Angeles Institute, the Journal of the Los Angeles Institute of Contemporary Art, I would come across advertisements for framing shops that were in Northridge, or I would come across artists who would write and then they would have Northridge next to their name. So I was coming across the Valley, but it wasn't until later that I felt comfortable. I sort of joke that it was after I got tenure that I can start doing this project, that I really started to search out this history. But it's there. I mean, it's always been there.
So you like excavating underdog stuff, would you say? Not necessarily underground, but I mean, moving from sort of focusing on LA and Ed Kienholz to looking at the Valley. What is it that attracts you to, besides being able to carve your own territory, what is it that attracts you to maybe overlooked artists and work?
Right. I've heard history described as you're either a historian who shines Klieg lights into the sky addressing important broad issues, or you're a historian with a flashlight that's shining your light into corners of overlooked history. So it just turns out that I am really most attracted to spending my time finding these overlooked figures. So I guess I'm a flashlight guy. And in fact, also my dissertation advisor, Donald Preziosi, who's a big light guy, he used to describe his role as an art historian as trying to trip things up. And as a fan of punk rock, I like that idea of tripping things up. And so I like writing histories that make people go, oh, okay, and then hopefully will question other narratives, just try to worm my way into broader narratives.
And going back to, was it called the LA Institute of Contemporary Art, the journal? You saw Northridge written on there, and that excited you.
Yes.
It made you feel like there's a scene, there's something going on in my valley. I wasn't being facetious, but you can laugh anyway. I thought, the other day I went and saw the show, and Damon gave a talk, and one of the things we talked about was how those people who were trying to get their voices heard in the larger world of art history, art criticism, or just the art world at the time, were getting looked down upon because these journals had that same Northridge address on them.
Right. So there was another journal called the Dumb Ox that was also published out of Northridge. And it's called the Dumb Ox because that was the nickname that St. Thomas Aquinas, I believe, took. But I actually think that the title says something about their approach, their view of what they were doing. There's a strain that runs through the art that I've chosen to show, and it's a sort of self-deprecation. And there's this phrase that I use: it's serious art that doesn't take itself seriously. So by naming your journal the Dumb Ox, and though that's a very theoretical journal, I mean, it's high theory. In the early 70s, there weren't many people writing about conceptual art, but there was Jim Hugunin, who was this incredible photographer who decides to publish this journal. But he decides to call it the Dumb Ox, and then he uses the format of a Hollywood gossip magazine. And it's almost as if he's undermining what he's trying to achieve. But he said that he actually thinks that the Northridge post office box was more of a detriment to people taking him seriously. The fact that the journal had, like this Northridge address, as opposed to the Dumb Ox title.
Okay. So people just looking down on L.A. from the east, and then even within L.A. looking down on Northridge as a satellite community.
Right. And I know that there's some students here. You might not be aware of the stereotypes that are, heavy on the valley, because I've given talks where I've spoke to high school students, and they don't. Maybe these stereotypes are less now, but when I was growing up, it felt real. In 1984, they split the area code, so all of Los Angeles used to be 213, and then all of a sudden one morning I woke up, and in 1984, there it is, 818. And I went to a high school that had students that were coming from around the city, but it was in the valley. And so if you were one of the 818 people, that sort of marked you different. In 1982, Frank Zappa had a #1 hit called Valley Girl that made fun of people from the valley as being materialistic, as being airheaded. Probably another stereotype that's emerged is the idea that the valley is the capital of pornography. Right, and again, it's all of these stereotypes are heaped on the valley, and I think it's much like how New York would heap similar stereotypes on Los Angeles at a certain moment when LA was emerging as a second city of contemporary art. A lot of New York intellectuals, snobs, I guess you can call them, thought of Los Angeles as being less than, as being less intellectual, as being somehow a joke, and so what I found, or just experienced, is that the valley then gets teased the same way that LA was teased. I guess that everyone needs an other.
Right, the valley as other. You included in this book a poem by Robert Pavlik called Chatsworth, and it opens, Chatsworth, in the San Fernando Valley, deemed to be a homogeneous landscape of single-family residences and shopping malls was my crucible, which I think is just a great opening for a poem and really speaks to the show as a whole, that people think of the Valley as this blank slate secondary place, and it was the crucible for so many of these artists. You've also alternatively described the Valley as the id of the city, and I was wondering if you could extrapolate on that without touching on pornography.
So the Valley, if you've never been there, the Valley is polluted, or at least it was really polluted. It's paved. It's sprawling. It has a lot of mini malls, a lot of 7-Elevens, a lot of liquor stores. There's a lot of graffiti. It's decaying. However, if you drive around Los Angeles, isn't that what LA? Couldn't you see the same aspects around Los Angeles? And so I described the Valley as id in the sense of trying to repress it, right? The ego and superego is trying to keep the id in check. And there's this aspect of LA history. Well, we'll just ignore this part of Los Angeles that might say something about the city, that actually might give a truer sense of the city, or at least a lived sense of the city.
Kind of like it's a part of the city that doesn't get to speak for itself or create a self-presentation, like we're Hollywood or we're Beverly Hills, or
right.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. Oh, yeah.
And yet, there is, I guess, an identity of the Valley, and I think that your book hits upon it.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's
like, why did you choose Panorama City as a locale for your book?
Well, because Van Nuys wouldn't be a very good title. That's one reason. There are a lot of different reasons, but it really it's basically this thing that you're talking about right now, because this book has a lot of things that are stripped down. The narrator is a very naive individual, and he's from a small town in Central California called Madera, which I think Madera Vista would not be a huge art show, but it might be interesting to pursue. In any case, he's from this small town, and so he comes down to the big city, but I didn't want him to go to LA proper. You know, I wanted him to go to something outside of LA, and yet of LA. And I wanted it to be a place where, as a writer who's interested in just looking at the world and looking at contemporary life, we weren't dealing with Hollywood. We weren't dealing with even, sort of materialistic, conspicuous consumption of the West Side, or, even beaches. I didn't want to deal in any of the stereotypes of LA that play on that sort of larger dialogue. I wanted to deal with this id thing. I wanted a mini mall with a psychic, and a storefront church, and a fast food place, and sprawl and semi trucks parked in people's yards, and that sort of thing. So that's why I went there to strip down a vision of Los Angeles.
And yet you could have gone to Culver City. You could have gone to Westchester. It's really great how I see the city, having grown up in the Valley. I feel very comfortable here off of campus. I feel very comfortable in these post-war suburbs.
Yeah. I have a friend came in and visited me in one of my post-collegiate dumpy apartments in North Redondo. I don't know if you guys have spent time in North Redondo, but he looked around.
He lived there.
Fantastic. In the early 90s. In any case, he just looked up at the buzzing power wires and the little boxy dingbat apartments, and he just goes, "This is LA's LA." And I thought he could have said the same thing in Chatsworth. He could have said the same thing in Downey. He could have said the same thing anywhere. I think it's just in the Valley. There's more of it. There's nothing to interrupt it. There's no beach. No. Yeah. Can you talk about some of the artists in this show and sort of how their work and how the show responds to all we've been talking about, like this sense of Valley-ness?
Sure. So I think that the PowerPoint has frozen here on Jeffrey Valance, and he's the perfect artist to start talking about the Valley. He grew up in Canoga Park. He lives in Canoga Park. was a student at Cal State Northridge. There he's playing Frisbee with Mayor Sam Yorty, the first Valley, or that's actually right in the middle there. Not in the white, yeah. The guy next to him is Seymour, who hosted a local horror movie night on KTLA, I think. And then next to him is the fashion designer who, like the list of the worst dressed people. Mr. Blackwell. So Jeffrey Valance describes some of his performances as trying to counter the boredom of living in Canoga Park. And he would come up with ideas, and then being a good conceptual artist, basically being what other contemporary artists were doing, coming up with an idea and then following that idea through, allowing the form to be determined by the concept. So the concept here was to help Mayor Sam Yorty bridge the gap between the youth of LA and the more established. So he wrote a letter to Mayor Sam Yorty, basically inviting Mayor Sam Yorty to play a game of Frisbee with him and his friends. And along the way, he somehow he includes the horror guy and he includes the fashion designer, and they're his buddies. There's a dog waiting for everyone to throw the Frisbees. But the important thing here is that he brought a photographer, right? Yeah. So this isn't some naive, untrained artist. This is an artist that understands that he needs to document his idea, and then the documentation becomes the art, right? And so he's very much of the Valley, from the Valley. And
he followed the Oscar Mayer Wienermobile around, is that right?
Yeah,
and
yeah.
You have that.
Yeah,
sure, yeah.
Just quit it now, yeah.
You have that. That's in the show as well as this whole case he made. This.
Right. So he was seeing little Oski, who was the mascot for the Oscar Mayer Wiener hot dog company, all around the Valley, going and doing these events. And so he decided to follow him and take a picture, pose for a picture every time that little Oski was around his home. So eventually little Oski lets the Oscar Mayer company know that there's this fellow who's following him around. There it is. And so they get in contact with Jeffrey Valance, and Jeffrey Valance makes this assemblage of all of the ephemera that he's collecting, the photographs and other sort of tchotchkes. And he presents it to the Oscar Mayer company, but then eventually he gets it back and then he sells it to a collector. So again, it's not completely naive. He understands what he's doing, and he makes sure that it's part of the art market, and that he creates these objects to really challenge the narratives of the emerging discourses of LA performance art. This is a work by Valance where he made these incredible drawings of the absurd architecture of the West San Fernando Valley, right? And the Avenue of the Absurd, which is republished in the book, is Ventura Boulevard. And you can still drive down Ventura Boulevard, which is the main artery of the valley. It goes from basically Hollywood all the way through Calabasas, and you can see old Victorian or new buildings that look like old Victorian mansions, or you could see many 7-Elevens and other forms of architecture. Here's a Dumox, but there are many artists that are practicing these contemporary art forms, and they're using the Valley as their palette, as their medium, as their inspiration.
Yeah, it's interesting because Valance, he's kind of a prankster in a way, but it's coming from a real embrace of the quotidian and a sort of daring you to not look at this as art. And I was doing some reading on him. He put up a whole fancy exhibition of Thomas Kincaid's work, which drove people insane. And he sort of was saying, is this also not art? And I find that fascinating because it's, as you said, it stems from the boredom, but there's also this sense of the quotidian or the ordinary and the everyday, which I also see in somebody like the photographs that John Davola was taking on his bicycle.
Right. And in fact, Ed Keenoltz, who I wrote my dissertation on, Ed Keenoltz had said, I want to make a work of art that pisses someone off to see it in a museum, to say, well, if he can be in a museum, why can't I be in a museum? And I think that Jeffrey Vallance, as well as some of these other artists, there is that sense of the ordinary, even though they are extraordinary artists, but why can't the ordinary be extraordinary? Which to me is quite inspirational. And yeah, there is that sense of maybe making fun of more dominant discourses, trying to force people to play their hand, right? Why not Thomas Kinkade? Why isn't Thomas Kinkade in the Museum of Modern Art? Now, if you say it's because he's a bad artist, then what does it say about... Come on in. So what does it say about the millions of people that bought his art? So are you an elitist or are you a snob by saying that Thomas Kinkade's not art? Then it really forces us to try to come to a definition of what is art. Is art only the objects that are in our museums? And if that's the case, then probably the majority of us like bad art or like these artists that aren't considered artists, right? So this work to me is actually institutional critique.
Yeah.
Trying to make us aware of how art is a construct of society. And really, these museums say something more about what we want to project, what we want people to know us for or as.
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially because I feel that by putting on this exhibition, you're redrawing some of those lines about what is considered inside or outside the art world. And I was wondering if you could talk about two artists specifically. John Davola, who took these very quotidian type of photographs. He rode around his bicycle in the valley and just would shoot photographs of women watering the lawn.
Well, yeah,
things like that.
Right. So,
and the other artist I want you to talk about is Seameyer and his performances, and sort of the way that Davola is doing something that seems very regional on the surface, and Seameyer, you can talk about what he did, and it seems extremely radical and avant-garde, but it turns out to be even more regional in a way.
Sure. So John Davola gave himself the task of every day riding his bicycle and taking photographs of things of interest around his Reseda home. He was going to graduate school at UCLA. He was a student of Robert Heineken, an amazing photographer. These are American scene photographs. There's a long history, whether it's Walker Evans or other American photographers who are, let's say Bill Eggleston, who are traveling around America taking photographs of the uniqueness of American life. John Davola just happens to live in Reseda. Mm-hmm. And so things that are just catching his eye are, funny phrases that are graffiti on the sidewalk, dogs jumping over walls, but he seemed to capture a lot of women watering their lawns. So if you look carefully, that's a dog jumping over that wall. It is horrifying.
Yeah, it's like the flash caught his eye or something.
And personally, when I was curating the show, during the process, I was attacked by dogs. And I had a horrible accident. And I chose that word. It's sort of a personal experience.
Well, those are the hard edges of the valley, the
yes.
Negative graffiti, the attacking dogs, and it's the counter image to the women watering the lawns.
That's right.
There's a decline and fall that's very punk.
Yes. And in fact, my experience of the valley is one of transition. And a lot of the artists that I've included are artists that grew up in the 50s and 60s when the valley was America's suburb. That was what the San Fernando Valley was known as. I grew up there in the 70s and 80s, and it wasn't America's suburb. It was starting to distort and dement and become something different. And so these images, I think John Davola captures them quite well. Not provincial, though they are of the valley. Now, Stephen Seameyer...
Well, sorry to interrupt, but Davola's like a famous artist.
Davola's a famous artist.
Okay.
And don't take it from me. You could go to the LA County Museum of Art. You can go to these museums that confer status on artists, and he's he's in these histories.
Right. Is C. Mayer a famous artist?
I don't know. Jim Sweeters is here. He's from CSUN. Is Stephen C. Meyer a famous artist? I think within a particular group. Certain circles. He was an incredible performance artist. He's probably better known now for his caring for the downtown art scene. He was one of the first artists to move downtown in the late 70s. He bought a lot of real estate. He rented to artists. And so before there was a downtown art scene, Stephen C. Meyer moved from Tarzana out to downtown. But before he did so, he squatted in an abandoned ice rink. And that was his studio. And he would have these unannounced performances that were really radical. I mean, some of the earliest LA performances dealing with issues of life and death and incredibly heavy material. In one...
You can just see this skating rink here.
Yeah. In one, he somehow came across a human fetus, and he used that in his performances. But these were in this abandoned ice rink on the corner of Reseda and Ventura Boulevard. And really no one knows about them. And so though an artist that's dealing with material that's transcendent of the location, those works at the time were really only known for two people that were in the valley going to those performances that were sort of like knowing of it.
Speaking of performance, there's a fascinating piece in the show that's like a time capsule made by Esteban Bojorquez? Steve Esteban Bojorquez. Can you tell us a little bit about Steve Bojorquez, Esteban Bojorquez, and the, what was his place called? The Chicken Shack. The Chicken Shack.
Right.
Yeah.
And Esteban Bojorquez, I didn't know that he was an artist, but I knew that, or I had always known of Steve Bojorquez as being the best surfer at First Point, Malibu, and that he was this sort of local legend. Starting research on the show, he had an exhibition at Cal State Northridge 5 years ago, maybe, that focused on his chicken shack, which he lived in a backyard chicken shack rent-free. And he converted that chicken shack into an art installation performance site where he made films. It was pretty bohemian. And he describes it as there was nothing going on in the valley, so he needed to create his own scene. He made the environment from found material, right, from cheap material. He was living rent-free. I think he was a plumber sometimes, and he was surfing all the time, but this became the site of a really amazing avant-garde installation that was in Reseda Canoga Park.
And if you get out to Northridge while the show's still up, he made a time capsule just for the show, and it's this kind of barrel thing half buried in this little dirt box. And you look inside this magnifying glass window, and there's a screen, a video screen inside showing archived performances from the Chicken Shack. I just find it fascinating that you've managed to shine your flashlight, as you say, on all of these interesting little pockets and these people who've created their own scenes, or like Valance, who was dreaming these things up in his bedroom or whatever. I wonder if then you could speak to the role of CSUN and the sort of mentorship genealogy of people who were connected to that scene, because it seems that you discovered more or less that is a real central core to this show, and not just because it's showing there.
Right. And it's not so much discovering. I mean, like Columbus didn't discover America. It was always here. CSUN has an incredible history. It was opened in 1958, and LA's art history is oftentimes told from the perspective of art schools and art programs, whether it's Chouinard that becomes Cal Arts or UCLA. And teachers play a central role, as do art programs, because LA is a centralist city. even the city, the center of the LA art world, there isn't really a center. Yes, there are museums, but the artists live all around the city. So these schools play important roles, almost like artificial communities, bringing people together that wouldn't necessarily have found each other. So Cal State Northridge, prior to Prop 13, was burgeoning. It was a school that could attract top-notch art faculty, and the school had incredible painters like Hans Burkhardt, who trained with Arshio Gorky in New York, Ed Sievers, a photographer, Robert Smith, who goes on and founds the Los Angeles Institute of Contemporary Art. There are these incredible faculty members that are serious artists who are coming to work in the Valley, and it just so happens that most of the student body are from the Valley, because that's what the Cal States were initially meant to do, to service the underrepresented populations of the city that couldn't afford to go to a UC. And so Cal State Northridge became this incredible center, and these faculty members became great mentors. And it's been a really interesting process. Someone like Ed Sievers, a photographer, who trains people like John Davola. This exhibition is sort of, we are now rediscovering Ed Sievers. Mike Mandel.
And Ed Sievers himself trained with Harry Callahan,
Right.
Studied under at RISD.
Right.
Another.
At the Rhode Island.
Yeah, Rhode Island School of
Design.
Design. Another great photographer. So there's a sort of genealogy down.
Right. So the front cover here, this is an image by Mike Mandel, who trained with Ed Sievers. While Mike Mandel was out for the opening of the exhibition, he went to the estate of Ed Sievers up in Santa Barbara, and he's trying to create a retrospective exhibition on Ed Sievers. And there's this renewed interest in Ed Sievers' work, not only because of this exhibition, but also because John Davola is becoming more and more well-known. So it's incredible how Ed Sievers helps his students, but now his students seem to be shining the light back on their mentor.
And speaking of Mike Mandel, can you talk about why you chose this, since we're here at a book launch, why you chose this particular image for the front of the book? And then after that, maybe a bit about the work that's on the back.
Okay. So this photograph, when I first saw it, this is from 1970, People in Cars. Mike Mandel gave himself the task of going to the corner of Victory and Coldwater, which is a pretty busy corner right in the center of North Hollywood, and take photographs of people turning right. Right? He was basically right on the corner. So when I saw this image, I, for a second, thought that was my grandmother. I swear to God, this looks like my grandmother. And my wife, who's here, she thinks it looks like my grandmother. And that looks like my brother. And that looks like me with the dumb look on his face. And even my brother said, when he saw this image, all that he could think of was us sitting in the back seat without seatbelts, playing the game where, like, every turn you, like, crush your little brother. So personally, I mean, it's an amazing image, but personally, I just had this attraction to it. Like, oh my God, this has to be the poster. This has to be on the cover. And it's just turned out, as well as I'm finding out that I guess my grandmother looked like other people's grandmothers, because I've had 3 or 4 people come and tell me, that looks exactly like my grandmother too. So it must be the hairstyle. Yeah, but it's a really remarkable image, though. There's something about this image that speaks to more people than just myself.
And since we're on the book, the piece on the back cover by Carla Claren.
Carla Claren. Yes.
This is a sort of view of driving, coming down the hill into the valley. It looks like with all the houses on the sides. It's reproduced very nicely here, but what you can't see is it's quite three-dimensional. This is a few inches in front of the houses in the back, and a lot of this is on newsprint. And when you see the work in person, it's absolutely fascinating to see where she's left exposed newsprint and classified ads and stuff from 1982 or 83. And you can see people trying to sell their houses back before we had Zillow. But it's really just, I mean, this is dull to say, but it's an astonishing piece of work. So that's one more reason I would urge you to drive up over the hill and visit the show in person, along with Shauna Horowitz's piece that's in the show, which was not able to be reproduced in the catalog, is a sublime piece of work. Can you talk about her history?
Yeah. Channa Horowitz, at the time that she started making work, her name was Channa Davis, was one of two women that was included in the LA County Museum of Art's Art and Technology catalog. Actually, the show had no women, but the catalog had two women. Channa Horowitz, when her work was first reviewed by the LA Times, the headline was "Pretty Pictures Made by Tarzana Housewife." So her work is actually quite sophisticated. I'm not smart enough to quite understand. It's based on the number 8 and sequences of 8. That's about as well as I can describe it.
And apparently the 8 came from the initial idea that she had for some certain kind of work. She was using a kind of graph paper that was 8 squares to the inch. Okay. And once she started with that, she just did not stop.
And she makes these incredibly intricate drawings and paintings, and they are sublime. She was from Cal Arts. She actually first went to San Fernando Valley State College, which was what CSUN was before it was renamed. She then goes to Cal Arts. So again, this isn't a naive housewife that just happens to make pretty pictures. This is a woman that was really creating minimalist drawings at a time when that was at the forefront, was very avant-garde. Later in life, she passed away, I believe, this year or last year. She was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship. She was included in the Venice Biennale. So she gains this recognition later in life, but for really most of her career, she was dismissed as just being a Valley housewife.
Speaking of Valley housewives, they're the women watering their lawns.
Right. And Carla Claren's painting Valley View, I forget how I got her name. The way it works when you start your research is sometimes being like a detective, and I was talking with one artist, and they said, you need to go and see Carla Claren, and I went to her studio, which is in Venice, and there was this incredible work, Valley Vista. And I was first going to show another work called Pool Roots, P-O-O-L, Roots, but the fact that the show is called Valley Vista and the work was called Valley View, and the work is truly remarkable. It is a physical object. It's not just a visual painting. It's an object that you have to see and walk around and read, but a really remarkable work that she says isn't just about the valley. It's more about her memories of growing up and these vistas of the sky, of a suburban experience, but that come from a valley experience. But she thinks it's beyond just the San Fernando Valley, which I think probably the valley can't stand for, or can be of more than just that valley. There are many valleys besides the San Fernando Valley.
Okay, so speaking of that detective work, did you have any sort of, after everything was signed, sealed, and delivered, anybody who popped up and said, hey, why wasn't I in the show, and you wish you could have a time machine and go back? And or are there any, I'm curious about other artists you might have come across who you felt like didn't belong in the show, even if they might have claimed that they would. It's an uncomfortable question to ask a curator, isn't it?
Luckily, they're not here, though. So
good point.
They may be here. Yeah. Trust me. And I've gotten many emails from artists who are wonderful, wonderful artists that I didn't know about. And I only had so much wall space. I only had so much word count. I only had so much time. And this is what history is, right? There's always another archive that you can go and visit. There's always another theorist that you can read. Yes, I've missed more artists that are in the show. And my go-to answer is I hope that someone else curates a show that challenges my exhibition, much like I'm trying to expand upon Pacific Standard Time. That's what to me, the Pacific Standard Time is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful project, and it's so wonderful that it's left the door open for more histories. And what I hope is that this does a similar thing, that people are motivated to continue to look in the valley or to rethink past histories.
So you're not going to do it?
Someone warned me that when I first started the project that they said, be careful, you might become the Valley art historian. And I don't know if I want to be the Valley art historian. Who knows what my next project will be, but it'll be dealing with broad issues, looking at particulars. Maybe it'll be an artist from the Valley, I don't know. But I don't want to be pigeonholed as just the Valley guy.
But more flashlight in the dark. No Klieg lights to the sky.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's the pattern that's emerging.
That's very cool. I guess we could probably take some questions from the audience at this time. Let me run around like one of those people who does that. Yes, Phil Donahue. Thank you.
So when I saw the exhibition, I was wondering how you gathered these materials together. So you have magazines and broadsides as well as the paintings and the other art objects. I just wondered, and I noticed that some are from private collections, others are not. Was there a main source for many of these materials, or was it really just an eclectic gathering?
It was, the artists were incredibly generous, so most of the work are courtesy of the artist. And I think that really tells a story as well. These weren't works that I'm borrowing from the LA County Museum of Art or the Museum of Modern Art in New York, right? This is
The artist's works.
yes. These are works that are either owned by the artists or in private collections. And plus, I didn't want all paintings or all performance work. I wanted an exhibition that was very viewer-friendly. I'm always sensitive to audience, and so hopefully you guys aren't getting too bored. There's beer back there. I think I saw some beer, so please get up and have a drink. So I wanted to have a show that was entertaining, but at the same time historical. But not so historical that it would turn off just the lay audience, right? I don't think that you have to have a PhD in art history to appreciate the work that's being shown.
Speaking of which, can you talk for a second about trying to find the Craig Stesick article in a research library and where you finally tracked it down?
Right. So I opened my essay with I basically talk about this article that was in Skateboarder magazine called "Things Are Happening" or "Things Are Hot in the Valley," and there's an image up there. And Craig Stesick is this legend LA artist, skateboarder, and he wrote a lot for Skateboarder magazine, and this article was under the pseudonym Sam Fernando, which is a cute play on words. So I had been in correspondence with Craig only by email. He's a very mysterious fellow, and so he would only correspond with me by email, and he at some point said, I think I might have written something about the Valley and Skateboarder magazine in 1978. So I came to the library, and I think I asked Jamie, can you help me find Skateboarder magazines from 1978? And I think we weren't successful in that quest.
It was a good stump to library.
Right.
Yeah,
So so for all the students here, I started at the library, and then I went to Google. Okay, so not the other way around, all right? So I started with the library, and then I went to Google, and I just did a Google search. I think that's what it's called, Skateboarder Magazine, 1978. And someone on Facebook, I think he's called like the Mad Taco Skates Again or something like this. Someone on Facebook has scanned every Skateboarder magazine from the 1970s. So I started to just go through page by page. So I finally get the article, and it's a great article. He's a great writer, and he's describing the Valley as, of course, the Valley is important to skateboarding history because it's all paved. He's like, of course it's happening out here. And then he says, there are great skateboarders, and he gives a list, and it's all Valley artists that I'm discovering as I'm doing research. I'm like, oh my God, someone was writing about this art history, and it was in Skateboarder magazine under the pseudonym San Fernando, to people that are reading the article that have no idea. They think that these people are skateboarders.
But they weren't even skateboarders.
They
were
weren't
just
skateboarders.
artists. Yeah.
No, maybe there were 2 skateboarders that were in there, but it was all his professors, all of his friends at Cal State Northridge. Yeah,
Epic.
so there it is. There it is. Yes. And in fact, it made me so happy that I found this on Facebook while sitting at home with the breeze coming through my window, as opposed to being at the Getty in their archives, having to have a pencil, like no pens allowed. It made me so happy that I was like, I'm starting my book with that. I have to. It was really perfect.
Amazing. Any other questions? Yes.
So this has been so thought-provoking. Thank you so much. And I have a million questions, but I'm going to try and boil down to one. But this might actually be we'll see where it goes. So it occurs to me, and I was thinking about this actually with the name Panorama City, and Antoine, what you said about Van Nuys being a terrible title. And then you mentioning Tarzana, and I was thinking about the names of the valley and the hope, and then you were talking about the 50s and 60s, and it was America Separate, right? And the kind of hopes and dreams of the post-war generation, and the ideal of the single-family house, and the little lawn, and the picket fence, all that stuff, and the sprawl, which seemed hopeful and optimistic, and the basis of a middle class. And then you were talking about the 70s and 80s and the kind of decline of that moment. And it just occurs to me in this heat wave and in this drought that and this sense of decline and the shrinking of the middle class, right? And I wondered, so here we are in 2014 and you're curating about the 70s and 80s. I wonder how it feels now at CSUN, because I have not yet been able to see the show, how it felt to you, or what kind of perspective you think it gives us about the suburb and the ideal and this kind of trajectory of the hope and the death and the decline and the rebirth into something else. And is this have you gotten some perspective about what, because it strikes me that a lot of these images are playing with the art historical record of ugliness, the kind of modernist project of the ugly, right? And that's part of this, why the Valley is LA's is because the post-war dream turned out to be ugly.
Yeah, much of it is ugly. But what's great is that when I started the project, my father, who grew up in East Hollywood, he described the Valley, when they moved to the Valley, he described the Valley as a he said it was a post-Depression Shangri-La. Like, who could have imagined this place where you can afford a single family home and you could have a yard and your kids can play on the streets, right? I mean, he saw it as a miracle. But as I grew up, you're right, I experienced it much differently. How it is today, it's a completely different area. Some of the most densely populated areas of LA are in Panorama City. And I used to joke that I was born in Panorama City. Doesn't that sound exotic? Right? Like, I was born in Panorama City. It sounds like a foreign, really foreign. Right, yeah. Tarzana was named after, Rice? Right, Rice Burroughs, right? And, right, like some of the names are from Chumash names. But yeah, today, the San Fernando Valley, I've had a few CSUN students approach me thanking me, and they're excited about doing their own Valley Vistas for the present moment. And it would look completely different. The artists would look different. The art is very different. But there's still that thirst out there for valleys to have their history told. But to answer your question, yeah, this definitely documents this transition, right? So I don't know if that answers your question fully, but by the way, these are the historians that are in the crowd. I'm getting nervous here. All right.
So I want to ask you to maybe take your flashlight and perhaps shine it a little bit into the air. You talked about when you went to Pacific Standard Time and how that sort of prompted your thinking, the absence of Valley artists in that narrative that was being provided about art in Los Angeles and the history of art in Los Angeles. And I'm wondering, based on what you've done with Valley Vista and the additional artists whom you've encountered from the Valley, how integrating Valley artists and the Valley into that narrative would change it. So what would Pacific Standard Time look like with the Valleys? The Vals.
Right.
I don't think I've ever been to
Sure.
Valley.
It would look.
I really don't. I'm from the East Coast. It's defensive.
So it looks more diverse. It looks more middle class. It looks more ordinary, I guess you can say, right? If you know LA's art history, the artists that are always repeated are these artists that really translate well in terms of photographically and in film. Their stories are remarkable. They're extraordinary figures, right? Ed Ruscha is an extraordinary artist, and he's cool. He looks like a male model. I mean, he's a good-looking guy. I'll say it. All right. I mean, like every time I show Ed Ruscha's picture from I think it was taken by Dennis Hopper. He hung out with Dennis Hopper, right? That's cool. So it's less cool, maybe, which I think then disrupts or at least makes you more aware of how history tells cool stories, oftentimes. And so hopefully it makes you more aware of how stories are told. I think it disrupts some of those histories.
Let's take maybe two more questions. You're all the way in the back. I don't want to neglect you, and then I'll get you over here.
That was awesome as always, Damon. And what I love about, every time you do work on LA, I feel like I've lived here and I know what you're talking about, but I rediscover it every time. And that's kind of the gist of the question is, I love the phrase serious art that doesn't take itself seriously. Right away, it's just so appealing. But, so what does that art take seriously if it doesn't take itself seriously?
Right.
And then, why are you serious about it? And that's fun with words, but what I really mean is that there's a double gesture. This isn't high art. This isn't this art. This is art that questions the boundaries of what art is. And it's grounded in the quotidian and this place that stands for the quotidian in a special kind of way. So there's something, you keep saying how good, this is a smart, this is a this. So there's something that goes snap. There's something that transforms a mere documentation of people turning right into this photo that when we see something there, and it's not, I don't think just because you're so good at telling us that there's something.
Right. Yes, you're right.
You know what I'm getting at?
Yeah.
There is something really different about what makes this art.
Yeah. Well, to your first point, Jeffrey Valance, I heard him speak one time, and he actually spoke here, and he did a probably his most well-known work is where he goes to Ralph's supermarket and he buys chicken, an uncooked chicken, and then he calls it Blinky the Friendly Hen, and he buries it at the LA Pet Cemetery, and then he disinters it. And then he has an autopsy done, and then he makes reliquaries from it, and it's all very funny, right? But what he says is humor is a human emotion, and why can't humor be our entry point into issues of life and death? And that's really what that work is about. And someone at the school, this was about 4 or 5 years ago, someone at the school said, "Are you making fun of Catholicism with those reliquaries?" And he said, "No, on the contrary. In fact, quite honestly, this moves me." And he was very sincere about it. So this idea of serious art that doesn't take itself seriously, it's just another starting point, humor as a starting point to deal with issues that all art has dealt with, or at least what has been considered great art, right? Life and death, tragedy. And then he also said, who hasn't been at a funeral or been sitting in a mass and gotten the giggles, right? There's oftentimes something very humorous about these serious things. What makes great art great? Compositionally, it's the artist has selected the best images. Mike Medell said he took hundreds of these photos, and then the series has, I think, 10 of them, right? So this image is a really well-composed image. It's balanced. Or there's some other images in the show, I think, up here, the time self-portraits where he's sitting on a bench, and the people on the ends are looking out, and then he and the woman are really looking at us. So I don't know if, I think it's called aesthetics, right? There's a whole philosophy of aesthetics, the idea that there's something about how things look that speak to us beyond linguistic knowledge, right? So it's always an uncomfortable, at least for me, to try to explain that, right? Why is it good art? Maybe Kant and Hegel were right every once in a while, and there's something inherently good about the composition. So I don't know if that answers your question, Paul, but I'm trying. And again, these are now 3 questions in a row of heavy hitters on campus. So this is good.
All right, well, here comes number 4. I think this might be our last question, and then we can mingle.
Yes.
Okay.
So the valley, as you know, it is pretty culturally diverse.
Yes.
Is that represented in the exhibition at all? Or during your research, did you come across artists from the various communities whose art might contribute to the history of art of the valley?
Sure. So the years that I'm focused on, the valley was transitioning. It wasn't as diverse as it is today. There is, in terms of underrepresented communities, Silmar and Chicano art is definitely represented in the show. But really, what I focused on was, I guess, would be more dominant artists. A lot of middle-class white men who are in the show. As a historian, I think that that's representative of the period, but there were other artists making work, yeah.
So what would Valley Vista from 1981 to 2014 look like? And maybe we can just close with that vision.
Sure. It would, the art would be more political, particularly identity. Those years were years in which contemporary art, and again, the Valley Vista that I would envision would be one that's conversant with dominant narratives, and art in the 80s and 90s were very much about identity. And so the artists that would be in that show would be dealing with issues of race, issues of gender, political issues. The artists would look different, and they would probably be less middle class and more lower middle class.
Yeah, I hadn't been out to Northridge in a while. I mean, my book came out in 2012, and my Valley research mainly was sort of double duty. I'd go to Babies R Us and buy a bunch of baby supplies, and then cruise around Panorama City, take pictures, and think about stuff. But I was just really amazed by the multiplicity of cultures that are going on, just as represented by the shops and restaurants.
Yes.
And, the little clothing shops, the little restaurants, all different cultures. Yes. It's amazing what's going on out there, and I'm really impressed with the show and what you've put together for Valley Vista. Let's everyone give Damon Willick a big round of applause. And I'm sure he'll be available for more personal questions.
So Damon, for those of us who haven't gotten out there yet, when does the show close?
October 11th. And just take the 405 to Devonshire, go left, go to Lindley, go left, and you will end up at the gallery. It's confusing. It's a big campus. Signage is poor, and I know that Carolyn Peter has the same issues on our campus. It is a university art gallery, so it is right in the middle of campus. It's hard to find, but it's worth the drive.
It is brightly colored, however, and just remember 405 to Devonshire, so that you know to at least start going that way rather than taking the Google Map route through the bottom of campus and the 101 and all that nonsense. The gallery directions on the website are perfect to a T.
There you go. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.